Get her out. Now. She doesn't belong here. The words sliced through the boutique's quiet elegance like a blade. Heather Langston's voice, sharp, controlled, and dripping with contempt, barely rose above a whisper, yet it commanded instant obedience. 2 security guards appeared on cue, and one of them, Jamal Cross, hesitated only a moment before gently gripping the arm of the black woman standing near the central display. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low, unsure. But before she could respond, Tyler Deacon swept in with the smugness of someone who'd never been told no. "Don't make a scene," he said coldly. "People like you don't exactly scream Morgan Veritas." Gasps fluttered from the nearby customers as their eyes darted between the confrontation and the racks of designer dresses. One woman clutched her purse tighter. Another slowly stepped away, whispering something to her friend. No one intervened. And still, the woman in the center of it all didn't raise her voice. She didn't plead. She didn't cry. She simply adjusted the sleeve of her jacket, looked directly at Heather, and said with startling calm, "You just made the most expensive mistake of your life." Heather blinked. Tyler scoffed. Jamal froze. What none of them knew, not yet, was that the woman they had just humiliated in front of everyone was Celeste Morgan, and Celeste Morgan owned every inch of the boutique they were standing in. Just an hour earlier, Celeste Morgan had pulled her sleek black Range Rover to a stop in front of a newly opened Morgan Veritas boutique on Oak Ridge Avenue, right in the heart of Ridgeport's polished North Haven district. The late morning sun glinted off the chrome accents of the storefront, casting crisp reflections against the polished glass. From the outside, the boutique looked exactly as she had envisioned. Clean lines, marble floors, curated lighting, the kind of place where luxury whispered rather than shouted. Celeste stepped out, dressed in crisp cream trousers, a cashmere turtleneck, and a camel trench coat. No entourage, no statement handbag, just a woman out for what appeared to be a casual shopping trip. No one watching her walk toward the entrance would have guessed that she was the woman whose name was etched into the brass plaque above the door. But that was exactly how she wanted it. Celeste wasn't there to make a grand entrance. She wasn't there to be seen or admired. She was there for something much quieter, much more personal. This was the first time she would visit the North Haven flagship since it had opened 3 months ago. While she had been closing overseas distribution deals and attending global fashion summits, the Ridgeport location had been entrusted to her regional team, and now she wanted to see it for herself. Unfiltered, unmanaged, and unannounced. She wanted to know how her staff treated the people they didn't recognize, whether the value she had built Morgan Veritas upon, accessibility, elegance, and dignity, still lived within these walls when no one was watching. But Celeste hadn't always moved through boutiques with quiet power. There had been a time when she was lucky to even get through the door without suspicion. She'd grown up in and out of foster homes, used to sharing bedrooms with strangers and meals that came in foil trays. When other girls were comparing homecoming dresses, Celeste was figuring out how to juggle double shifts at the diner and overnight janitorial work at the airport just to keep her community college tuition paid. She didn't dream in brand names. She dreamed in balanced sheets and freedom. And when she finally opened her first storefront, a dusty, barely held together resale shop on the edge of town, no one believed it would last a year. But Celeste didn't care. She wasn't there to impress. She was there to prove. That first shop taught her everything. How to spot quality in a sea of secondhand cast-offs. How to treat every customer with the kind of warmth she herself had never received in places that reeked of wealth. She saved every penny, reinvested, expanded. One store became 5. 5 became 20. Then came her pivot, the birth of Morgan Veritas, her own line. A brand she built from scratch with the goal of redefining modern luxury. High fashion that didn't require a pedigree to enter the door. And now, after all the flights, the sleepless nights, the boardroom battles, and whispered rejections, she was a global figure in fashion. But no matter how far she rose, one memory refused to fade. She was 12. Her foster mother had taken her into a department store downtown, a rare moment of hope. They had saved up for weeks to buy Celeste a dress for her middle school graduation. It was pink, tea-length, and when Celeste reached for it, the saleswoman slapped her hand away. "Don't touch unless you can afford it," she'd said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. That moment never left her. And years later, on the night Morgan Veritas turned its first $1 million month, Celeste had taken that exact dress, replicated by her own design team, and placed it in a glass case at the original store, as a reminder, as a promise, that no one walking through her doors would ever feel what she felt that day. And yet, that promise was precisely what brought her here now, walking into her own store unannounced, deliberately dressed like just another customer. She didn't need the recognition. What she needed was the truth. Had the people she hired, the ones with the glowing resumes and firm handshakes, truly understood what Morgan Veritas stood for, or had they forgotten the mission behind the marble floors and curated playlists? Celeste intended to find out. She opened the door and stepped inside, letting the warm air and the gentle scent of cedar and rosewood envelope her. Everything looked perfect. The mannequins stood poised in custom ensembles. The lighting highlighted every shimmer and stitch. There was champagne tucked in glass flutes at the styling bar. She almost smiled. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel pride. But then she caught sight of the woman behind the register. Blonde bob, navy blazer, narrowed eyes. Heather Langston. And the way Heather's gaze locked on her, for a fraction too long, told Celeste everything she needed to know. Across the store, a young man with slicked back hair and expensive loafers gave a discreet glance in her direction. He didn't greet her. He didn't smile. Instead, he whispered something to Heather and began walking toward Celeste, his posture already dripping with the kind of performative helpfulness that so often masked deep judgment. Celeste took a steady breath and stepped deeper into her own store, fingers brushing the hem of a black silk gown she herself had approved during design phase 6 months ago. It was beautiful. She was proud of it. And yet, in that moment, she was no longer the CEO. She was once again the outsider, invisible, suspect, and they were about to make a mistake that would cost them everything. Celeste moved quietly between the racks, her fingers trailing along fine fabric she herself had chosen months ago. Silk chiffons, satin drapes, delicate tulle embroidered by hand. This wasn't just merchandise. These were pieces of her story. But now, standing amid them incognito, she felt the first pulse of tension tighten behind her ribcage. A low voice called from just over her shoulder, oozing a syrupy politeness that reeked of condescension. "Hi there," said the young man in the tailored vest and smug expression. His name tag read Tyler. "You might be more comfortable browsing our sales section in the back. There's some great options there, and a little more budget-friendly, if you know what I mean." Celeste turned, slowly, her posture calm, her expression unreadable. "I'm actually interested in this collection," she said, gesturing toward the front displays. "Thank you." Tyler's smile stayed glued in place, but his eyes flicked over her outfit. A cream sweater, relaxed trousers, a trench with no visible labels. Not poor, but not wealthy enough, apparently. "It's just, most of these pieces run a bit high," he added, tone dropping half a key. "4 digits and up. We don't want to waste your time." Celeste let the comment hang. She didn't bristle, didn't defend. She simply turned back to the display and pulled out a black evening gown with precise, understated beadwork. She had designed it to speak without shouting. In this moment, it mirrored her exactly. Celeste lifted the gown gently from the rack, holding it up to the light to admire the sheen of the beadwork along the neckline. It was a piece she remembered approving herself, inspired by vintage Parisian silhouettes. Elegant, timeless. "I could try this one on," she said, her tone even. Tyler blinked, visibly caught off guard. "You won't try that on?" He gave a short laugh. "Awkward best, offensive at worst. Just so you're aware, that piece is $3,000. It's not exactly off the rack. I can read the tag, Celeste replied, the corners of her mouth unmoved. I'd still like to try it on. Tyler hesitated, then looked over his shoulder. As if summoned by his discomfort, Heather Langston emerged from behind the central counter, clipboard in hand, a pair of narrow heels tapping briskly across the floor. "Is there a problem, Tyler?" she asked, her eyes already scanning Celeste's outfit before the question left her lips. "She wants to try on a more gown," Tyler replied, shrugging, as though the request was mildly absurd. Heather paused. Her gaze swept over Celeste from top to bottom. One slow, calculated pass. "Those gowns are delicate," she said, choosing her words with a veneer of civility. "We try to reserve them for serious clients." Celeste met her eyes directly. What defines a serious client? Heather's expression didn't change, but her tone chilled. "This is a curated luxury experience. We have standards to maintain, and we can't just let anyone handle premium items." Celeste didn't raise her voice. She didn't shift her posture or let emotion crack the smoothness in her tone. "I see," she said slowly. "So your discretion decides who qualifies for luxury?" Heather folded her arms loosely, shifting her weight with a practiced air of authority. "We're trained to recognize buying behavior. It's instinct, and with high-value merchandise, that matters. Our clientele expects exclusivity, privacy, consistency." Tyler stood nearby, arms crossed now, clearly enjoying the escalating exchange. Celeste turned toward the counter and picked up one of the boutique's business cards. She traced her finger across the embossed logo, Morgan Veritas, then read the tagline aloud, her voice barely above a murmur. "Modern elegance, universal respect." She looked up. "Do you still stand by that?" Heather's jaw tensed. "Look, I don't know what point you're trying to make here, but this isn't some chain store. We don't hand out experiences to anyone who walks in off the street. We have to be careful. It's about brand integrity." Celeste studied her for a beat longer, then gently placed the gown over her forearm. "Then I like to speak with the owner," she said, clearly and without hesitation. Heather blinked once. Then the corners of her mouth curled ever so slightly. "We're not hiring," she snapped. "And no offense, but the owner doesn't exactly meet with." She stopped herself, but was already said. The message was clear. Celeste's gaze held steady. "People like me?" she asked quietly. Heather didn't answer. Tyler snorted. "I'll call security," he muttered, turning toward the back. The mood in the store shifted. The line had just been crossed. Heather said nothing, but the way her lips pressed together and her shoulders stiffened told Celeste all she needed to know. The verdict had already been made, quietly, confidently, and with complete certainty. Tyler, meanwhile, returned from the back room, still chuckling under his breath. "The owner," he repeated, shaking his head. "Lady, the owner of this place is worth tens of millions. She built a fashion empire. You think she's going to stroll into this store to chat with you?" The laughter came sharp, clean, and humiliating. "She's probably on a yacht in the Mediterranean, not trying on dresses in Ridgeport." Celeste didn't respond. She simply reached in her wallet and pulled out a sleek metal credit card. Matte black, heavy and unmistakably elite. Without saying a word, she placed it gently on a marble counter. Tyler stopped. Heather stared at the card like it had grown fangs. She picked it up slowly, flipped it over, held it against the light, tapped it against her palm. Her face twitched. "This looks suspicious," she said, her voice too loud, her words carrying across the boutique. "I'm going to need a call for verification." A silence spread through the room, broken only by the quiet hum of soft jazz in the background. Two women near the shoe wall turned to watch. A man near the fragrance station leaned in closer. The whisper started low. "Do you think it's stolen? She doesn't look like she belongs here. Should we call someone?" Celeste stood still, hands folded in front of her, expression unchanging. But inside, something ancient had just begun to burn. Heather dropped the card onto the counter like it might contaminate her manicure. This could be fake, she said loudly, as if performing for an invisible audience. I've never seen a version like this. And the name isn't on file. She nodded toward the entrance. I'm going to ask you to leave. You're creating a disruption. Before Celeste could speak, Tyler stepped forward. You heard her, he said, puffing himself up. We'll have to involve security if you don't comply. The irony was brutal. This woman, whose name graced every tag, whose vision shaped every garment, whose money had built the floor beneath them, was now being treated like a threat in her own sanctuary. A moment later, Jamal Cross, the store's lone security guard, approached. His stance was neutral, but the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes betrayed him. Ma'am, he said quietly, I need to ask you to step outside. Celeste looked at him, just for a breath. And in that moment, Jamal seemed to hesitate, but not enough to stop. His hand hovered near her elbow, guiding but not gripping. Customers had stopped pretending not to watch. Phones were out. A woman near the window whispered, She's being escorted. Celeste didn't resist. She allowed herself to be walked to the entrance, posture upright, expression unreadable. Just before stepping through the door, she turned. Her gaze landed on Heather, then Tyler, then swept across the store. Her voice was soft. You just made the most expensive mistake of your life. And with that, Celeste Morgan walked out of her own empire, unseen by those who should have known her best. The door clicked shut behind her, sealing the boutique in silence as Celeste stepped into the bright midday sun. She didn't rush. She walked calmly toward her Range Rover, each step a deliberate refusal to let them see how deep they cut. The moment she sat in the driver's seat and pulled the door closed, the noise of the city fell away. Inside, everything was still. No music, no voices, just her own breath, sharp and tight in her chest. Her hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white against the leather. For a long minute, she didn't move. She just sat there, staring straight ahead, trying to quiet the fire roiling just beneath her ribcage. Then, slowly, she reached into the center console and pulled out her phone. She tapped a single contact. No hesitation. Danielle picked up on the first ring. Celeste, everything okay? Her voice was warm, steady, but alert. Celeste didn't answer right away. She looked out the windshield toward the boutique's entrance, where shoppers drifted in and out, blissfully unaware. When she finally spoke, her voice was lower than usual. Danielle, she said, we have a problem. The pause that followed wasn't from confusion. It was recognition. Danielle knew that tone, and she knew what it meant when Celeste used it. Tell me everything, Danielle said, her voice dropping into that calm, capable register she used when crisis was near. Celeste exhaled slowly, her fingers tapping once on the leather armrest before she spoke. I went in quiet, she said. No makeup, no entourage, just me. I want to see how they ran the place when no one was watching. She paused. They didn't recognize me, Danielle. Not a single one of them. Danielle said nothing, letting the silence hold space. Celeste's voice dropped. They judged me the second I walked in. The manager sized me up. The sales guy told me to check the sale rack. When I asked to try on the more gown, they laughed. Said it wasn't worth my time. Said I probably couldn't afford it. Her voice cracked for just a second before she caught herself. Then I gave him my card. Heather said it looked suspicious. Said I was disrupting the store. Called security. They escorted me out of my own store. Danielle inhaled sharply. Celeste, but Celeste was somewhere else now. Back in a department store in Detroit. Years ago, standing beside her mother in a borrowed coat, watching a clerk fold a dress she would never be allowed to touch. She could still hear her mother's voice in her ear. One day, baby, they won't be able to do this to you. Danielle's silence on the other end stretched just long enough to turn heavy, that her voice came back, low and tight, with disbelief. You're telling me they threw you out? Celeste didn't answer right away. Her gaze remained fixed on the boutique's glass facade. They escorted me out, she said at last, in front of everyone, with customers staring, phones recording. Danielle let out a breath like she'd been punched. Heather Langston. She was hired through corporate staffing while you were in London. I reviewed her file. Her numbers were solid, references flawless. Her judgment, Celeste said coldly, was not. Danielle's tone shifted. What do you need from me? Cancel everything on my schedule for the next 3 hours, Celeste said. Pull the legal team on standby. Notify Richard Langford. I'm making an in-person stop at North Haven. He'll know what that means. Done, Danielle said, already typing furiously. Anything else? Celeste's hand tightened around the phone. Tell security I want 1 rep from corporate, not store level. Discreet but visible. And Danielle, yes. This isn't about me, Celeste said, her voice hardening. It's about every person they've made feel small. It's about the message they just sent wearing my name on their uniforms. Danielle didn't respond with words. She didn't have to. The rustle of rapid keystrokes was answer enough. Celeste ended the call and let the phone rest silently in her palm. For a long moment, she sat still, eyes locked on her own reflection in the rearview mirror. No longer the woman who had been brushed off, laughed at, or quietly ushered to the door. That version of her had burned away the second Heather said, people like you. What remained now was something far colder, far clearer. She reached into the back seat, pulled out the garment bag she always kept stored for emergencies, and unzipped it. Inside was the suit, sleek, black, perfectly tailored, the one she wore for board meetings and press interviews, the one that made people straighten their backs and lower their voices. 15 minutes later, when Celeste stepped out of the vehicle, she was no longer dressed for browsing. She was dressed to reclaim. Her heels struck the pavement like a metronome, steady and sharp. In her hand was the same platinum card they had doubted, now clipped beside a leather portfolio embossed with her initials. The boutique still stood as she had left it, busy, unaware, pristine on the surface. But the atmosphere inside was about to rupture. They had made a mistake, a costly one, and Celeste Morgan was coming back, not for revenge, but for clarity, for justice, and to remind everyone who exactly built the house they had tried to lock her out of.
The boutique's entrance chimed softly as the glass doors opened, but the air that followed was anything but gentle. Heels clicked against marble with measured force. 3 slow steps that made every head in the store turn. Celeste Morgan had returned, but this wasn't the same woman they'd humiliated less than an hour ago. Now, she was wrapped in tailored authority. Jet black suit, silk blouse, sharp heels, and a presence that hit the room like a dropped gavel. Behind her walked Danielle Avery, calm and composed in an ivory blazer, tablet in hand. On her other side was a man in a dark, nondescript suit with an earpiece and watchful eyes. Corporate security. And flanking the trio, just a step behind, strode Richard Langford, Regional Director of Morgan Veritas, face taut, phone already in hand. Every conversation stopped. Every shuffle of fabric or flick of hanger froze mid-motion. Even Mrs. Evelyn Radcliffe, now seated near the lounge, stood slowly with a frown etched into her face. At the register, Heather Langston's mouth parted ever so slightly. Her fingers instinctively smoothed her blouse. Tyler, standing nearby, turned pale, his posture stiffening like a soldier in the wrong war. No one needed an introduction. They knew. Instinctively, intuitively, they knew. And as Celeste stepped forward, scanning the room with ice-cold precision, she stopped just inside the store's heart and said clearly enough for all to hear, "Everyone, stop what you're doing. Right now." The silence was immediate. The reckoning had begun. Celeste took 3 more steps forward, slow and unflinching, until she stood directly in front of Heather Langston. Their eyes locked, one filled with dawning panic, the other with frozen purpose. Celeste didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "You," she said, each word shaped like a scalpel. "The woman who had me escorted out of my own store." Heather's jaw dropped slightly, but no words came. Behind her, Tyler shifted, glancing frantically between faces, searching for a cue, a script, anything to undo the moment. My name, Celeste continued, her gaze never leaving Heather's, is Celeste Morgan, founder and chief executive officer of Morgan Veritas. A sharp gasp rippled through the boutique. A customer dropped a folded blouse. A stylist in the back covered her mouth. Evelyn Radcliffe's eyes widened as she brought a trembling hand to her chest. Heather blinked rapidly, her voice cracking under the weight of it. You weren't on the schedule. We didn't know you were. No, Celeste cut in, her voice ice. You didn't, because I came as a customer, not as your boss, not as a billionaire, not as a symbol, just a woman walking into her own space. She let the silence settle like ash, and I was judged, mocked, dismissed, shamed. She turned slightly, letting her voice carry across the room, by the very people I trusted to carry this brand. The entire room seemed to hold its breath, caught between disbelief and dread. Celeste wasn't finished, not even close. She turned her full attention back to Heather, her tone now clinical, like delivering a post-mortem on a failed experiment. Let's walk through what happened, shall we? She said. I walked in alone, no announcement. You saw a black woman in neutral clothing and assumed I didn't belong. Tyler was the first to approach me. He directed me to the sales section. Tyler flinched. I was just trying to help, he stammered. Celeste ignored him. When I requested a try on one of our flagship gowns, the very piece I approved for this season, you questioned if I could afford it. When I insisted, you laughed. Actually laughed. Tyler's face burned red. It was a misunderstanding. I wasn't sure. You weren't sure someone like me had the means to belong here, Celeste finished for him, each syllable carved with disdain. Then Heather arrived, and rather than de-escalate, you escalated. You questioned whether I was a serious client. You said you couldn't just let anyone handle the merchandise. And when I asked to speak with the owner, you suggested I leave. Heather's mouth opened, but nothing emerged. Celeste didn't pause. Then I placed my platinum card, tied to the accounts that fund your paychecks, on that counter. She pointed toward the very spot, and you declared it suspicious. Loudly, publicly. You humiliated me in my own name. A stunned silence followed, heavy as iron. Heather looked like the floor might swallow her. Tyler was barely breathing. Celeste turned then, not with rage, but with something quieter, weightier. Her eyes found Jamal Cross, who had remained still near the entrance since her return, his posture rigid, jaw locked tight. Mr. Cross, she said, and the use of his name made him straighten instantly. You were the one who escorted me out, correct? Jamal nodded once, slowly. Yes, ma'am. Did I raise my voice? No, ma'am. Did I threaten anyone? Steal anything? Cause a disturbance of any kind? No, ma'am, he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper now. Then why did you remove me? Jamal shifted, a flicker of guilt visible behind his composed exterior. Because I was told to, he said. It was a direct order. I didn't think I had a choice. Celeste studied him for a moment, eyes sharp but not cruel. You did. We always have a choice, even when it's hard. He nodded, eyes lowered. You're right. And I'm sorry. Truly. It was quiet, sincere. The first apology spoken not in fear, but in recognition. A few customers watching from the lounge glanced toward him with something that resembled empathy. Celeste gave a small nod. Thank you for owning that. She paused, then turned back to face the center of the room, letting her voice rise again. Because accountability is the one thing missing from this entire store. And with that, her gaze settled back on Heather and Tyler. Until now, Danielle stepped forward, tablet in hand, already accessing internal logs. Beside her, Richard Langford's face had hardened, his arms crossed as he observed the room with the poise of a man preparing for official fallout. Celeste's voice remained calm, but something in her cadence had shifted, now measured like a closing statement. What happened today isn't just about poor customer service. It's about systemic disrespect, she said, eyes sweeping the entire staff. It's about what happens when people entrusted with a brand forget that behind every luxury item, every number on a quarterly report, there is a name, and in this case, it's mine. Heather looked down. Tyler stood frozen, fingers twitching. You treated me like a criminal, not because I was disruptive, not because I violated policy, but because of how I looked, because of a story you wrote in your mind the moment I walked in. She stepped closer to the front counter, placing both hands lightly on the edge. This company was built on the belief that elegance doesn't require exclusion, that respect should never be gated by assumption. Her voice lowered, and you violated that belief. You didn't just misjudge me. You betrayed the foundation this brand was built upon. She paused, letting the weight of her words echo. Then she said quietly, which means you no longer belong here. The stillness in the room turned cold. A line had been drawn, and on the other side of it, Heather Langston and Tyler Deacon were already standing alone. Celeste didn't raise her voice when she delivered the verdict. She didn't need to. The quiet in the room made every syllable land like a gavel. Heather Langston, she said, looking the manager directly in the eye. Effective immediately, you are relieved of all duties and permanently terminated from Morgan Veritas. Your access has already been revoked. Your credentials disabled. Corporate security will escort you out. You are not to return to any location under my name. Heather's mouth opened slightly, a desperate plea forming, but it never made out. She nodded once stiffly, then looked down, hands trembling. There was no protest, only the realization that her entire career had just collapsed in front of a boutique full of witnesses. Tyler Deacon, Celeste continued without pause, turning toward him. Your behavior today was entitled, discriminatory, and deeply out of line with this company's values. You are also terminated effective immediately. Leave your badge and step aside. Tyler's mouth moved, searching for words. I didn't mean to. You did. Celeste cut him off. You meant every look, every smirk, every insult wrapped in a smile. His shoulders sagged, and for the first time, he looked not just embarrassed, but small. Danielle nodded to the corporate security officer, who stepped forward in silence. Heather and Tyler stood frozen for a moment longer, then moved slowly toward the rear hallway. They didn't look back. They didn't say a word. The silence behind them was louder than any applause. Celeste stood tall, unmoved. The reckoning wasn't personal. It was necessary.
Celeste turned back toward the center of the boutique, her eyes sweeping the room with unwavering command. The tension that had hung moments ago now began to shift, replaced by something more reverent, more alert. She wasn't here to humiliate. She was here to rebuild. To those of you still here, she began, her voice resonant but calm. I want you to understand something. What happened today was not just about two individuals. It was about a culture, a mindset that still believes it can measure worth by appearance, status, or skin. A few heads nodded quietly. Others looked down, shame rising in the silence. I built Morgan Veritas, she continued, to be more than just fashion. It was meant to be a space where elegance and dignity coexist. For everyone, where no one has to prove their humanity to be treated with grace. Her gaze fell on the younger staff near the fitting rooms, who'd watched the entire confrontation in stunned silence. That mission, she said, was violated, and that ends today. Danielle stepped forward, handing her the tablet, now showing the company's internal dashboard. Celeste glanced at it once, then addressed the team again. New training begins immediately. Diversity, empathy, accountability, non-negotiable. Every team member, every store, starting today. She paused, letting it land. Because no one, she said softly, should ever be treated the way I was treated in my own name. The words didn't need emphasis. Their truth carried them on their own. As Celeste lowered the tablet, a figure stepped forward from the lounge area. Evelyn Radcliffe moved with graceful hesitation, her silk scarf slightly askew, eyes shimmering not with defiance, but remorse. She stopped a few feet from Celeste, and placed a gloved hand over her heart. "Miss Morgan," she said, voice steady but shaken, "I want to apologize. Not because I mistreated you, but because I stood there and said nothing while others did." The room fell into a different kind of silence, one of humility. "I saw how they looked at you," Evelyn continued. "I heard the words. I watched you stand there with dignity while they chipped away at it. I did nothing because I thought maybe it wasn't my place." Celeste nodded once, her expression softening just slightly. "And yet," Evelyn added, "here I am now, because silence in moments like that is complicity." Her voice cracked just enough to make the air feel heavier. "I've shopped in this store for years. I've always believed in what it stood for. But today, I learned belief without courage means nothing." A long pause followed. Then Celeste stepped closer and reached out, gently placing her hand over Evelyn's. "Thank you," she said, "for choosing to speak, for choosing to grow. That's what makes belief matter." Evelyn blinked quickly, brushing a tear. Around them, others lowered their heads, not in shame, but in reflection. Something was shifting. Something was being restored. Celeste turned toward Richard Langford, who had remained a silent sentinel throughout the confrontation, absorbing every word with the quiet precision of a man who understood the stakes. "Richard," she said, her voice regaining its executive cadence, "effective immediately. I want a full audit on all Morgan Veritas locations. Staff behavior, incident records, customer feedback, every single file. No blind spots." Richard nodded, already pulling up internal systems on his device. "We'll deploy regional liaisons starting tomorrow," he said. "I'll have every store manager briefed by end of week." "Not briefed," Celeste corrected. "Immersed. I don't want memos. I want presence. I want to walk the floor, meet every customer, listen without filters." Her eyes swept the room again. "If we're going to stand for dignity, we have to live it, store by store, rack by rack." Danielle was already coordinating with corporate HR, sending out internal flags, scheduling new training modules. The boutique itself had shifted energy, still hushed, but no longer brittle. It was as though everyone now understood that what had happened wasn't isolated. It was systemic, and Celeste, instead of walking away in anger, had chosen to lead through the debris. "We either rebuild with purpose," she said, looking directly at Richard, "or we shut it down entirely. There is no middle ground." Richard met her gaze. "Understood. We'll make it right." Celeste gave a single nod. "Then start here. This location becomes the standard." The message was clear. Redemption begins at the root. Celeste faced the remaining staff, some wide-eyed, others visibly shaken, all silent. Her voice, though calm, held no room for misunderstanding. "Let me be very clear," she said. "Working here is not just about selling clothes. It's about carrying a name that was built on sacrifice, resilience, and a promise." She let that settle. If you cannot treat every human being who walks through that door with dignity, regardless of their appearance, accent, background, or bank account, then you do not belong here. And that is not a threat. It's a fact. The employees nodded slowly, some blinking back emotion, others simply standing still, absorbing what they should have always known. Celeste glanced toward the customers still lingering in the space. "To those of you who witnessed what happened today, thank you for staying, for listening. This may have been uncomfortable, but discomfort is how change begins." One customer, a young woman near the accessories table, whispered, "Thank you." And Celeste offered the smallest smile. She didn't need applause. She didn't want validation. What she wanted, what she demanded, was change. Real change. Without drama. Without denial. Just truth. She turned toward the door. Danielle and Richard followed. Security held it open, not for a VIP, but for a leader who had just rewritten the atmosphere of an entire brand. As Celeste stepped into the light, she didn't look back. The message had landed. The work had begun. And dignity had finally reclaimed its place on the floor. 6 months later, the North Haven boutique didn't just recover. It transformed. The once hostile space now carried warmth. Greeters didn't judge by shoes or skin, but by smiles and sincerity. New staff were trained not just in product knowledge, but in empathy. Monthly audits revealed not just numbers, but stories. Evelyn Ratcliffe became a quiet ambassador, often returning with friends, not just to shop, but to share. She told the story, unflinching, of a day she failed to speak, and how that failure had opened a new kind of courage in her. Jamal Cross, still in his post, had become a champion of the new standard, speaking at internal seminars, reminding new hires what happens when silence takes the place of conscience. Danielle Avery had since risen to Vice President of Global Culture Initiatives. And Richard Langford, he oversaw a 92% training compliance rate across all locations within 3 months. But Celeste continued walking into her stores quietly, never announced, never accompanied, just a woman checking on the spaces that bore her name. Not to catch people failing, but to ensure they remembered why the brand existed in the first place. On a quiet afternoon in early spring, she paused beside a mannequin near the front of the North Haven flagship. The dress it wore was a replica of the one her mother had never been allowed to buy. She smiled just slightly, because now, no one would be told they didn't belong. Not here, not ever again.